"The war has ruined us for everything." A quote from the 1929 Erich Maria Remarque novel Im Westen nichts Neues, translating to Nothing New in the West, later titled All Quiet on the Western Front. In recent times, Netflix captured the hearts and minds of many with its German language adaptation of the story. However, in my Nightmare Fuel episode on it, many comments said that it didn't reflect the book all that much. In the same episode, I admitted to not yet seeing the 1979 adaptation, which many comments said is the far superior version and the best reflection of the book. One day I would like to cover the novel in its own episode, but today I'm finally going to meet the request I've had in abundance. Let's talk about 1979's All Quiet on the Western Front, whereas per all Nightmare Fuel episodes, there will be major spoilers ahead. For those unaware, the novel was first adapted to the screen in 1930 with the Oscar-winning Lewis Milestone version. Heralded as one of cinema's all-time most important anti-war films, it took nearly 5 decades before we saw another version, which came in the form of a TV movie by ITC Entertainment directed by Delbert Mann. It assembled an all-star cast including Ernest Borgnine, Donald Pleasance, Ian Holm and Di Bradley of Kes fame. This British-American production went all out, with filming mostly taking place in Czechoslovakia, then Soviet-occupied, and cost producer Norman Rosemont $100,000 to obtain the rights to make the film from Remarque's widow, Paulette Goddard. Picking up a Golden Globe and an Emmy, this version is held with very high regard amongst not only Western Front enthusiasts, but among those with an interest in World War I. And one thing that is for certain is that the bleak, crippling stomach blows that Western Front delivers connect with force in this 1979 version. Let's dig deeper into the Nightmare Fuel trenches. The overall premise remains the same as all versions of Western Front. We experience World War I from the perspective of the German forces, and are directly linked for the film's entirety to a young student turned soldier named Paul Baumer. In this version, he's played by Richard Thomas, most famous for playing John Boy in The Waltons. He enrolls into the army in 1916, slap bang in the middle of the First World War's duration, though they weren't to know that, of course. What I love about this particular iteration is how the very first scene is an introduction to the men. Not only do we meet Kat, Borgnine's character, and Paul, but we also follow a line of soldiers. Paul's narration gives a name and a fact about each of them, gradually working along. What I love about this is how it makes you connect with all of these people. You realise right from the opening scene that these people are people with identities and aspirations and lives, and had the rest of the line been followed, it's guaranteed that all of those men would have had the same treatment. The power of Western Front is in making you realise that in war, everybody is significant, and that makes what happens to them throughout the film all the more difficult to digest. The film takes a different approach in its storytelling methods. In the 1930 version, we see the men at college, then the training camp, then the front line. The 2022 version is similar, though removes the training camp element. Here, we bounce back and forth, starting with the men on the front line before over time shifting us between the war's continuation and the men at college, then training, then meeting each other for the first time. Again, I really like this storytelling method because it continuously recontextualizes the characters to keep things interesting. Plus, pacing-wise, from an audience perspective, it means you get a balance between action sections and character sections. Because of this, I think that overall, this version is the strongest by way of character development. Ernest Borgnine is spectacular as Kat. He's the elder veteran who is placed with a squad of new young recruits, and one of the first things he tells them is to unlearn what the training camp has taught them. This is rather harrowing, as the implication is that the training camp procedures, which in this film are grueling and relentless under Ian Holm's Himmelstoss, are effectively pointless because when it comes to their application in the field, they don't compare. The knowledge that Kat has is based solely on his experience and what the war effort is really like. This is scary to me, as there's an entire step in the process of enrolling to being on the front lines that is practically irrelevant, demonstrating that the trainers likely haven't set foot in battle, yet are trying to prepare men for battle. It's almost like the people with power over the recruits actually going to war have no pure idea what it's actually like. This is something that can also be picked up by the teacher who inspires the young men to enroll. This is Donald Pleasance's character. Each version of this teacher on screen has the same purpose and the same issue. The purpose is to get the men to sign up and fight for the glory of the fatherland, to go off and become heroes. The issue is that he himself won't be signing up and going to fight for the glory of the fatherland. It's a key example which plays into the idea of war being a plethora of young men dying for the desires of a couple of old men. And even the soldiers in this film clock onto that, in a scene where Kat asks his men if anyone actually knows what they're fighting for. Does the Kaiser even know? When you break war down, it's immeasurable suffering for immeasurable gain. People would often die in their hundreds just to acquire a few feet of land. Is that what all of this is really for? Because if so, what is desirable about owning land where the grass has been fed by blood and bone? It's senseless, and the soldiers in Western Front are aware of that. They are where they are because someone nowhere near the war wanted them to be, for a purpose that even they probably don't know. The level of scarring this film provides is gut-wrenching, with several key scenes executing perfectly the sheer barbarism of war. We get the key scene of Paul killing a French soldier in a bomb crater, seen in every film version. It's very similar to the other scenes, so I'll keep my analysis brief here. But the difference maker for me is that I felt the time in this version go by much slower. It's not an instant kill. Paul stabs the soldier and his agony-filled groaning lasts overnight, ultimately driving Paul insane and making him want to help. The fact that Paul waited for so long before taking the decision to help is the scariest part. It's not like instant regret seen in the 2022 version. It's a delayed reaction brought on only by how long he's had to listen to the Frenchman's pain. The man eventually dies despite Paul's aid before Paul asks for forgiveness. It's as heartbreaking as all the other versions. Additional haunting moments come from a young German soldier falling into a mustard gas crater. Only for a few seconds, but that's it. The death note is signed in this incredibly brief period of time. Kat wants to shoot the young man to put him out of his misery, though the medics get to him first. Kat exclaims, "A baby, just a baby," about the man, not only showing the age gap between them, but that effectively a child in Kat's eyes has suffered a fate worse than death prior to death. It's a difficult scene to watch. The war, however, doesn't just impact human beings, it impacts other living creatures too, which this version demonstrated in a tormenting fashion. It comes when during a battle, the war horses are injured and a passionate soldier, played by my guy from Titanic, screams for the horses to be shot. These otherwise majestic, beautiful, peaceful animals have now died a painful and frightening death at the hands of humanity. The impact of war is felt here on not only men, which I think was an extremely poignant inclusion to the narrative. The screams of the horses. Ugh, I won't be forgetting that. However, one kind of animal that does benefit from war is Paul's narration regarding corpse rats, who specifically feed on the bodies of the dead. The imagery here of dozens of rats crawling around the remnants of battlefields, picking away at the flesh of these men, was definitely hard to stomach, both visually and conceptually. The torture is just never ending, both physical and psychological. Paul's friend, Franz, has one of his lower legs amputated but can still feel that his foot is cold. That in itself is haunting, but the most unsettling moment in this scene comes from one of the men shouting for an orderly to come and aid Franz. Franz says the line, "They don't come, they never come." To me, what this says is that there is so much going on and so many men injured requiring assistance that there simply aren't enough people to provide care. The wounded outnumber the healers. But there's another layer which implies how often the orderlies are shouted for to come and help. It could be seen as though they don't respond too much, indicating that they hear cries for help all the time. Each cry is desperate and justified, though I read this scene as one that implies the volume of cries for help, and how after a while there's almost no point in responding. All hope is lost in these facilities. And that extends later into the film too, when Paul and his friend Albert are injured and go to hospital. They learn of a room called the Dead Room, the place where soldiers are taken to die. The fact there's a specific room for that purpose is bone-chilling. We also experience the psychological effects on the men. One injured man is so desperate for the suffering to end, he attempts to kill himself with a fork, something mirrored in the 2022 version, albeit in a much more gruesome manner. The saddest line here is due to Paul shouting for help when he discovers the man stabbing himself, and when they get there and save the man, Paul is told, "Why didn't you leave him alone?" It's the idea that this man would have been better off killing himself rather than living on with the daily endurance of the scars in his mind. Paul recovers fairly quickly from his injuries, though Albert doesn't. He grows jealous of Paul and slips into depression, requesting a gun from Paul so that he can take his own life too. The fact that War's deathly embrace can extend to those who are no longer in the heat of battle is one of the most telling narrative points of the story here. War has no rhyme or reason to who it can impact and how it can impact them. Paul's narration says that men can be killed in bomb-proof bunkers by bombs, which by name alone doesn't make any sense. Or he can be out in the open for hours where you'd expect to get hit and get away unscathed. It's totally random, unselective, indifferent. War can kill you with its own hands, or it can puppeteer your hands into doing it. And the 1979 version is perhaps the strongest version in that particular element. The climax of the film comes with the two key story elements of Kat dying, here done in a very similar fashion to the 1930 version, followed by Paul's death. What I loved about this version of Paul is how quiet and unassuming he is. He's a man who doesn't speak an awful lot compared to the other men, at least in the earlier portions of the film. Spending time in the war brings that side out of him more. But the strength here is how Paul enjoys drawing. While in college, he draws a lark sitting on the windowsill. He admires the beauty in nature and is a great artist. His death here comes full circle, as while on the front line, he begins to draw another bird. He stands to get a better look at it before a sniper hits him in the head. It's a sudden death, a blunt death, an unremarkable death. That's a sad thing. We've really grown to know Paul as a person, who he is, what he likes, how he carries himself. One bullet from a stranger completely snuffed that humanity out of the world, and that creativity with it. All Paul wanted was to have a nice, peaceful life, admiring the beauty of the world. However, his world ended in the cold, the damp, and the mud, all while drawing what would become his final piece of art. It's such an icy ending, amplifying how fragile life is, and during a time of war, how important it is in the scheme of things. I loved this version of Western Front, and though it's perhaps the least gruesome, with personally the weakest visuals for me, despite being raw and authentic looking, this version is the strongest for character connectivity and demonstrating war's clutch on more than just human beings. Plus, just like the other versions, it is a very real world dose of nightmare fuel. Until next time, I've been Connor from Unleash the Ghouls, and thank you very much for watching. Cheers.